The other day I had a rather short but interesting discourse with a YouTuber by the name of the Vegan Transition, specifically about the last video I made about Harambe the gorilla. And one thing that I like about in-depth discourses on YouTube and comments and stuff like that is that sometimes in thinking of your replies, you think of good ideas for videos. And one of the things that popped into my head was to talk about, in my time as an intern and working as a full-time zookeeper, the reality that I killed animals. Specifically because I think that's profound on some level, and I realize that there might be people watching my videos at some point who are within the vegan plant-based community who could be thinking about a serious career in animal care at zoos or at private facilities. And if you hold these kinds of beliefs, that's probably something you're going to be faced with at some point. And you're going to have to say something. Or decide not to say something. Not judging here. But for this video, I wanted to talk about my experiences around animals that were killed and killing animals myself. And I want to start from, I graduated college with a degree in zoology. During college and a little bit after college, I worked at several small private animal care facilities. And one of the realities of a small private animal care facility is the role that donations and basically free meat comes in. I worked at two places that cared for wolves. And one was actually a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They had animals from a species survival plan and stuff like that. But when you're able to get and when you're working with an animal that's protected like that, what you can feed them is limited. There's certain kinds of things you can collect. I remember that one summer we got a huge order of bison meat that had been freezer burned. And that was big because bison was one of the wild animals, one of the wild types of meat that you could feed those animals. So donations, small facilities don't have as much money as a big zoo. So when you get free offers, it's worth your while to take that. I remember the first animal that I ever dealt with dead and feeding them out to carnivores was a sheep. I believe it was my sophomore year, the summer of my sophomore year. I worked at a wolf facility, and we got a sheep one day, a big ram that had died of natural causes. And I remember, because of the full coat of wool he had, there was a question of that being kind of gross and not knowing all about that, and also the wolves not responding to it because they usually don't deal with tearing through something like that, whether or not they just ignore it and it would be a waste. So we decided to skin the animal. And whether you're skinning or butchering, I worked at another place that we got several horse donations during a summer, and for the ram anyway, those can be really, really long projects, the butcherings. And by the end of it, you've hacked at so much connective tissue. I remember we started at the legs, we started at the ankles, made incisions, worked under the skin, worked our way up, and eventually got a full pelt off. And you just hack so much connective tissue that by the end, it starts to look a lot less like an animal and just a task to finish. But I remember, like, when you got a big animal like a ram or a horse, that was a big deal. That was something that everyone kind of helped out with, because whether you're taking off the legs, you're taking off the head eventually, which was an axe job rather than a knife job. After a while, the knives all get dull because you're cutting hair, and that dulls the knife. That's a team building thing in that field. You feel the togetherness in doing a big job, getting a big job done, and producing a lot of food that you can feed the animals, making a big boon for your organization. That's one thing I recalled about that. You planned for those events. You made sure you had people that were comfortable with that job people that worked well together. And that was, how you spend the day. That was a hard job to do on your own. I remember there were some people who could do it on their own. I remember at one zoo there that I worked at later, there was a specific keeper on staff who that's what they did. They butchered horses. And I remember another story about a keeper who tried to do it one day and basically couldn't really figure it out, and the whole animal was lost because we couldn't really store a big animal like that. You had to cut it into pieces. But I just remember the feeling of getting a job well done at the end of those, and it was not a pretty job. And I remember at one of the places, the place that had a staff member who did the butchering actually shot the animals, but at one of the other places, we didn't shoot the animals. The owners had to do that. And I remember one time we had an owner come in. He came in with the trailer with the horse. He basically we moved the animals over to the other side of the exhibit, and we wheeled the horse trailer right in. We reeled it right into the enclosure. I remember the manager asked him what kind of weapon he had with him, what he was going to use to do the deed, and he pulled out a .22 caliber, basically like a pistol. And if you've worked with like a big animal like a horse, that's a legitimately large animal, and that's a legitimately small gun. Ideally, you have a long, large weapon that'll take one shot and it's done. A small weapon like that. And I remember we were all huddled inside the keeper building, and I remember hearing the gunshots. Boom. 10 seconds later, boom. A minute later, boom. Boom. 4 shots, might have even been more. It was horrible. The animal was probably scared. It was in pain. And I don't think we ever invited that guy back again. We ever took a donation from him again. But you experience, even not directly involved in the killings, you experience real instances of animals going through some real things when people don't do the right things. Later on, after I graduated college, I mostly worked at the private facilities during college, but later on I moved, after I graduated, I started working. I had an internship at a real zoo, and it was a much different game. There's more money there, but I remember where we were situated out in the northwestern United States. For whatever reason, that place got a lot of horse donations and chicken donations. From what I understand, after several years, chickens stop producing as many eggs, and the farmers have to make a decision: is it worth me continuing to feed this animal, even though it's not producing? So I remember there were a few times we got donations of more than 5 chickens, and we would get horses on the regular for, I don't know much about horses, any number of reasons why an owner would give them up, I suppose. But at that place where we had that staff member, I remember his job was to butcher and kill horses. And I remember there were stories, I never saw it, there were stories of how he would get the animal to stand still so he could shoot it. I remember there were stories about holding out an apple to the animal. He was apparently really skilled and had a lot of background in this field. There are other stories about him just holding up his hand saying, look at the birdie, and getting the animal to look in a way that he could get the spot that he needed to. Very simple, very almost jocular, childlike air to it, of a very serious, applied to a very serious thing. And so that was very real. I never saw that, but I heard stories about it. It was a thing. I remember it was at the same place. That was the first time I actually killed an animal. Again, we used to get chicken donations. We would get a lot at a time. And it required a few people in order to do that job. I was the one, because I attributed it to baseball, developing a consistent baseball swing, but I was apparently the guy who they felt like could put the axe in the same place relatively when they needed it to. So I was the person who lopped off heads that summer. And that was a big deal. because we got a lot of those. And again, that was, free food for the lions, free food for the bears. But I remember you needed one person. You basically got out a board and you would take out the chicken by its legs. And you had one person hold on the legs, one person hold on to the wings. And I would cover the head and pull the neck out a little bit so I had enough area to aim for. And sometimes I could do it in one shot. More often than not, it was a couple, maybe three. And once the head was off, the team had to quickly work. You had to have someone on a rubber neck, a barrel as well, with the top. Because once the head was off, you had to throw the chicken right in that barrel. Because the saying, running around like a chicken with its head cut off is very real. They're still firing synapses to the body. And, the boxes would shake, they would rattle, they would fill with blood. Basically, if you didn't throw it in there, blood would fly everywhere because the animal would be flopping around and stuff like that. It was rough. It was real. I got blood on my uniform before, splatters of blood from cutting chicken heads off. I did a lot of that summer. But that was very real. There were keepers there. When you're an intern sometimes at those facilities, you do things the keepers don't want to. And there were people who weren't comfortable with some of those activities. There was a manager there, person in charge of the department, who wasn't comfortable with killing animals. I sort of felt like if you're going to feed them out and you're going to feed live animals, I didn't think... Generally, that's not considered ethical, feeding live animals. The animal that you're taking care of can get hurt, and it's a stressful and scary situation for the animal that's being fed out, which has irony to itself. You had to do the deed on animals that you got, and there were some keepers that couldn't do it, so that got relegated to interns. And I'm not gonna lie, it made me feel kind of important that I was, the key point person on some of these things. I remember especially killing rabbits. That's where people didn't want to get involved, because killing rabbits, you literally grab them by the scruff and you have a small bat, like a small baseball bat, and basically what you do is you just bash them in the face until they're dead. It's not as clean cut, not as organized as killing a chicken. It's kind of throwing crap at the wall. You're gonna break their skull. I remember the first thing that would go would be the nose. You'd crush the nose, blood would start sopping out, and you knew they were dead immediately when they stopped flopping uncontrollably. They would do like a jumping motion just in your hand as you were holding them, and that's how you could tell the last synapses were firing and that there was no more life in this animal. It was just an uncontrolled automatic response. And the screams that they would make, it was like a baby banshee, like a banshee scream from the movie, just stereotypical, but like a baby one. It was horrible. It was very real and extreme. And I remember you would do it maybe 5, maybe 10 times. Some people were better at it than others. I was okay at it. But I remember you put them near the sewer grate on the cement and just let them kind of bleed out. And I remember there were sometimes if an intern wasn't comfortable with it, they would have them just kind of hold on to a bat, and they would kind of go to the dead carcasses and they would practice hitting the head, basically kind of turning into a pulp a little bit. And I always thought that was a little strange, but that was something that was legitimately recommended by professionals. You had rabbits lined up against a sewer grate and interns basically giving love taps, just not comfortable with the process at all. Not necessarily being forced to do it, but it's strongly being recommended. In some ways, I think it was looked down upon by certain keepers that you wouldn't do it because you were an intern. You were supposed to do what you were told to do, kind of. But other people understood it, especially since there were a good amount of people who weren't comfortable with it, admittedly. But that's, I spent that summer doing a lot of that. I remember when I actually became an employee at my first zoo, the ones that I worked at as a keeper, there were very different opinions on killing animals and accepting roadkill, which we did at the smaller facilities. We would, you would take deer that were reported on the side of the road. We would go check those out. If they didn't look gross, I think the big thing was if they had discoloration in the abdomen, because that can mean like a pathogen infestation of some kind, or bacteria building up down there that might not be good for the animals. But at other facilities we would do that. When I went to the zoos, there started to be more opinions on that being safe for the animals, so we didn't really do that so much. But one other reality that I was faced with when I worked my first job, my full-time job as a zookeeper, was you had to do pest control. Because I'm especially living in the northeastern United States, when it came winter, big buildings like a tropical forest, or those are warm places where cockroaches, mice go to live. And especially where there's sitting out food, where you have pans of food sitting out overnight that maybe the animals don't finish right away. That's free game for animals to potentially go in and try to get. So you do have to control for that, because there are certain animals out there that can carry disease, and you're working with exotic animals that aren't used to other animals in that area. And it's a real threat that they could get some kind of illness. They could be exposed to something that they can't handle. So it's a reality that you have to control for pests. And I think most often we would use peanut butter, and we would set up the snap trap mouse traps, the classic wooden ones with the metal clamps that spring. And I remember, those, when you were done, you had to clean them and stuff. They got rusty. There were times when you didn't have enough time, or they were kind of annoying and gross to set up. So one other thing that we had was we had glue traps, which are basically little pieces of cardboard that kind of look like cereal box material, that have like a big area of just like glue material, just kind of like slathered onto them. And what we would do is we would set those up along walls, because mice, from what I was told, they like to run along things. They like the walls and stuff like that. So if they see something that's a threat, they have easy access to a hole. They don't like to be in the open so much. So we would put them up against walls. We would put traps up against walls. Sometimes we would lean like boots or boards up against them, because apparently mice also like to go under things against walls or behind things. So we would set up boots up along against the wall with just enough space that a mouse could go through, and we would put a glue trap on the other side. And one of the big ethical thing with those is, if you set those, you had to check them the first thing you came in, because animals do get trapped in those. They don't always get killed right away. Sometimes they go overnight and they haven't eaten. They're very stressed out. Same principle with a snap trap in the wild. If you don't check it, wolves and stuff like that, and animals that have been trapped in those chew their legs off sometimes, like all kinds of horrible things that they go through. So you check those immediately. But I remember there were times when a leg was just caught and the animal was still alive. And I think in most places, protocols, you gas animals. I think we gassed a raccoon a few times at another place I worked at. There were certain animals that you had to actually call the Fish and Wildlife Service to handle. You couldn't handle yourselves, but some you just kind of took care of. But there were some places that gassed mice. There were only certain people who were trained to gas animals, and there are times when, if your boss is the point person for that they're in meetings, or they have real things that they have to do that day. They don't have time to have every keeper come with them. If you catch 3 mice, to come with them with 3 mice. So you have to make that decision when you have a lot of routine left to do, cleaning, putting animals out on exhibit for the day, bringing animals back in for the night, where you have to make real decisions about what you're going to do. And there were times when I would just put that glue trap in a bag, and I would put it on the floor, and I would just bring the heel of my boot down once, twice, just as fast as I could, just as cleanly as I could. And then you just threw it in the waste bin. So pest control is a real reality at a lot of places. And you have to deal with that. And of course, now I've talked about it before, but I'm not really in the zoo game. I'm not sure how I'd react to this stuff now and how I'd respond to what I would have to say. In fact, I think the most impactful story that I have is something that might be one of the more benign ones, but when you see the videos of the videos that vegans post of like calves being dragged away from their mothers, cows being taken from their mothers, born strictly so the mothers would produce milk, they don't always, I feel, talk about what happens to those animals. And I remember one time I was out at a place in California, and one day we spontaneously, the manager said, "Get in the car, guys, get in the car." And there was like 4 of us in this small truck, and we drove like 2 or 3 hours to this no-name place. We drove in. It was mostly concrete, but you saw like the herds of cattle in stalls and stuff like that, just driving by like miles and miles of cattle. And eventually we came to this lot, this concrete lot, where at the center there was an overhang, and under it were these 2 big boxes, big black small buildings. Eventually we realized they were freezers. And I remember we just kept on, there was an attendee there, and he opened it up for us, and we just kept pulling, and he left, and we just kept pulling out these black bags, really heavy, maybe 60, 50 pounds each, something like that. I remember I could lift them, so they weren't that heavy, but I'm not that strong. But excuse me. But we kept on pulling them out. We just filled up the back of the pickup truck with those, and then we drove back. And I remember opening those for the first time, and inside each of those bags was basically a rolled up baby calf. I never asked about it. I never thought about it. It was a big boon for us. Those lasted us for a long time. Again, that was a real part of your job. That was a real positive when you got something like that in that field. And at the time, I didn't even think about it. No one really talked about that. No one really discussed what was going on. No one really ever thought about it. I only think about it now, knowing what I know and believing what I believe now. That I reflect on the reality of what happened to those animals, the reality of why they were born, the reality of what led to them being there, and the severe ethical ramifications of it. And again, I wonder what I would say now. Because that would be a real thing where if I had vegan beliefs that I would have to say something, and I would have to risk the reality of saying that you weren't willing to do that or be a part of that, and what that would mean for your performance evaluation, how keepers or your boss would think of you, and possibly a recommendation further on. And working as a keeper, if you're not willing to do pest control, you're not doing a part of your job. You're not doing everything you can to protect the animals. That's how that would be viewed. I remember we would actually keep tallies of who caught the most mice, who killed the most mice in the break room at times. And it was, again, a team building thing, kind of. I also remember at one of the wolf places I worked at, one of the things that they offered during kind of their off season was they had a famous vet come in. And he was well known. He was an authority on anesthetization drugs, basically darting an animal and how to take care of them while they're knocked out, and how to do it in the field. And they offered a course where they took some of their animals and they actually tranquilized them, and they had people who paid to be part of that program would go through a whole examination, all the things you look at when you do something like that in the wild. And it was a learning experience. There were people there who weren't actually looking to get in the animal care field. They were just doing it because they thought it would be an experience. I'm not in that field anymore, and I did it, so who's to say where the value came from there? But those animals were, when you knock an animal down, that's generally what it's called. It's a tricky situation. When you think of a human, there's a number of doctors there. There's a specific doctor who works with that. You've got tubes in you and stuff like that. With an animal in the wild, especially in the field, there's not that. If an animal, when when they're knocked out like that, their body is in a bit of disarray. They can't necessarily regulate their temperature as well. Lungs stop, heart stop, animals overheat. I remember during that thing, there was one wolf that actually had to be doused with water, and another one who needed hot water bottles put on it because its temperature regulation was out of whack, and that's dangerous. So there was real stress with capturing those animals, restraining them, darting them, and I don't think we darted anything that day. I think every animal was restrained with Y-poles was the restraint method for wolves, and then we actually injected them. So yeah, I believe that's the more correct one. We didn't actually dart anything. Another place we talked about darting, but not here. But the animals went through real stress and were in there was real concern over animal health during that time, strictly for the purpose of teaching people, some of whom really didn't get any lasting professional value out of it. And no one really said anything. And I wonder specifically, sitting in that meeting, going over what we were going to do, whether or not I would have the courage now to stand up, knowing that I put money in this, knowing that no one was going to be on the same page with me and what I would have to say. I suppose I probably wouldn't do that, but at the time I thought there was real value to learning that, thinking what my career aspirations were. And it's interesting to think of what I would do now. And I just think that's really all I have to say on this topic. Kind of a harsh ending, but I think there's real realities of killing animals and causing animal stress, even in situations where you may be helping them, trying to take care of them, killing other animals to take care of other animals. That if you're a vegan or you're interested in that lifestyle, that you'll have to deal with at some point, and you'll have to come to terms with, and you'll have to come up with your own answers for. And that's very, very real. Like, share, subscribe. Talk to y'all later.